Okay guys, so let's jump into another tier list ranking. So as you can see, we've got the films of Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson being the legendary New Zealand director behind classics like The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit trilogy, and King Kong and a few other great films. There's a few documentaries and a film that he wrote and produced here as well, but I won't include those last three because they're not his feature films. So we'll just get into his 13 movies that he actually made. So kicking off with The Lovely Bones, this is a really solid film. I think it's pretty underrated. I enjoy it quite a bit. Stanley Tucci was amazing. I really like how the film is actually quite dark and focuses on this kind of murder mystery. Where it loses it for me is, I think, where it loses it for most people when it goes into the kind of afterlife spiritual realm, where it focuses on Susie Salmon's character kind of coming to grips with everything. I think that really lets the film down, the way they did that and how much time they spend focusing on that in the movie. But everything in the real world kind of is really awesome and makes for a really entertaining film. But overall, it's a solid B-tier movie. Next up, we have King Kong. This is another great film. It's a much better film, actually. It's a 3-hour epic, and I do like the extended cut, which is like 3 hours and 20 minutes long. I do think this film is great. I think it has a few visual effects that are a bit iffy in it, but for the most part, the visual effects are actually incredible. I wouldn't put it in the S tier, but it's close because I can't really put it in the S tier because we are ranking this against the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so I'll just put it in the A tier. But it has some great adventure, it has some great visual effects, a really good soundtrack, interesting characters, all the stuff on the island is incredible, and even though there's like an hour of film before that when they're on the boat and things like that, it's still really interesting and entertaining, as well as when they come back to New York at the end of the film. So it's a really big, epic kind of movie, and I really enjoy it a lot more than most people seem to. Sorry. Next up, we will jump into the why don't we just do the Middle-earth films? So Lord of the Rings here, obviously all three of these films are classics, they're incredible, they're three of my favourite movies of all time. A lot of people just include them as one film because they pretty much are just one big epic story. But yeah, I'm going to put them all in the S tier. I think that the first one has always been my favourite, so Fellowship of the Ring is my favourite, then Return of the King, which is the third movie, and Two Towers, which is part 2, is my least favourite of the three, but it's still excellent and better than like 99.999% of every other film out there. That's just the ranking of them individually, but all as one, they're definitely a high S tier film. And like, honestly, on my favourite movie lists of all time, these movies would come up in like my top 10 list as well, so that's how good they are. If there was a higher tier than the S tier, they would make it into that as well. They're just such epic classic films, and I grew up with these movies, and the extended cuts, even though they're like 4.5, 5 hours long, they're all like awesome, and they're just perfection pretty much. So like, yeah, if you haven't seen them, then see them. But yeah, most people have seen them by now, or at least heard of them and seen parts of them. Yeah, they're definitely worth seeing though, they're pretty epic. So we may as well go into the Hobbit trilogy after that. So these Hobbit films are pretty good. They're not quite as good as the Lord of the Rings. Well, actually, they're not anywhere near as good as the Lord of the Rings films when you're comparing them. But personally, my favourite is part 2, The Desolation of Smaug, because it has Smaug in it and some really great sequences there. I think it's actually solid enough to be in the A tier. So we'll put The Hobbit Part 2 in the A tier with King Kong. Yeah, the barrel sequence is great. All the stuff, as I said, with Smaug, the ending, how it leaves you on a cliffhanger. I just remember seeing part 2 in the cinemas, being like, yeah, this is how it should be. And I didn't really get that from parts 1 or 3, unfortunately. So I still enjoyed part 1 and part 3, but as I said, nowhere near as much as part 2. I think they really lacked in like the pacing and things like that, and over CGI in the third film. I enjoyed part 1 better than part 3 though. I'll put that at the top of the B tier with part 3 behind it. So yeah, as I said, I still do enjoy those two films, but definitely not as much as the one in between them. Sorry. So next up we will go with The Frighteners. The Frighteners is okay. I'll put it in the C tier because this was the only one on the list I wasn't sure about, because I couldn't remember it. So I went back and rewatched it like a week ago, hoping that I would enjoy it more. And it's just okay. Like, it's pretty much in the same position I had it in before. Watching it again, Michael J. Fox is good. It's interesting seeing Peter Jackson just before he went into the Lord of the Rings big budget kind of epic films, working with visual effects and things like that. The film overall, it's kind of reminded me of like Ghostbusters or Beetlejuice, you know, where it's got that horror comedy element to it, but just for me personally, it's not really my kind of taste, but it was okay. So Heavenly Creatures is another one he did in the 90s that I thought was just okay. I'll put that in the C tier as well. A lot of people actually like this movie quite a bit. I thought it was alright. Kate Winslet was good. She's one of my favourite actresses, so it was cool to see her, and pretty much I think it was her first film. So that was cool to see. But as an overall film, I just thought it was a bit average and forgettable. But it was okay. So we'll go into Peter Jackson's first two films from the 80s. So I don't like these movies, but they definitely establish him as a director as far as his style goes throughout his 80s and 90s career, because he started with these really cheap, low-budget, overly gory, overly crude, kind of violent films with little budgets. So we had Bad Taste from 1987 and Meet the Feebles a couple years later. I think Meet the Feebles is slightly more entertaining, but they're not quite F tier films because they're actually very creative, and it's interesting seeing where Peter Jackson kind of came from, and there's some entertainment to be had in those films, but overall they're pretty bad. But it is interesting to see kind of where he started and how he would go from making movies like this to the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of like, wow, like he really went from one end of the spectrum and the scale to the other with those films. So yeah, it's interesting as far as seeing where he came from and where he started with a low-budget film like Bad Taste. So last but not least, we have Dead Alive or Brain Dead. This movie has two titles, and this kind of was his big film after his two first films. It had a bit of a bigger budget. It looked better, and it was definitely in that same realm of overly gory and comedic as well. And I actually like this film quite a bit. Like, this is the only film of his pre-Lord of the Rings that I like. So I'm going to put that in the B tier as well, but down the bottom. Because, yeah, I think it's more entertaining, it's more fun, it's more well-made, more interesting. As far as his first two films go, they're kind of hard to follow, they're kind of hard to get into. But Brain Dead or Dead Alive was a much better film, I think. It's just so kind of gory and disgusting and over the top, though. It's like the most bloody, violent kind of film you'll ever see, but it's all done in a comedic sense. So while it's disgusting, it doesn't kind of like haunt you because of how like serious it is or realistic or anything like that, because it's so unrealistic and over the top. But definitely just don't eat while you're watching it because it's pretty disgusting. So yeah, as I said, that's all his films. There are a few documentaries and things like that down here, but these are his 13 films that he's actually directed. He hasn't made anything in like 10 years as far as a feature film goes, so it would be cool to see. He was supposed to come back and do the Tintin sequel that Spielberg started. That would be really cool to see, but until then, this is what we have to work with. So obviously the Lord of the Rings trilogy is incredible. King Kong and The Hobbit Part 2 are incredible as well. And I like all the films in the B tier. I wouldn't really recommend anything in the C or D tier though. But he's an excellent director, just from that top couple of tiers alone. So definitely check him out if you haven't seen some of these films there. As I said, King Kong gets a bad rap sometimes, or The Lovely Bones, but I actually enjoy those films. So if you haven't given them a go, definitely check them out. And let me know your ranking as well down below. And thanks for watching. Bye.